Wiglaf saw some fire was now coming back to Beo's eyes, and his heart sang. This was the king he knew and loved. This was the man he had followed into hell, and every time, this was the man who had led him safely home. The giant warrior who willingly chose to do what all others would not, and who Wiglaf would follow to the ends of the earth to be with him as he did so. He was his friend who he admired above all others. I fear I do not have long before my strength will no longer be sufficient for the task at hand, Wiglaf, but win or lose, I must go now to face my end in battle and attempt to rid our people of this cave-dwelling serpent that has terrorized us for too long. Perhaps some good may still be done before my passing. He picked up his shield and tested his arm's ability to hold it above the wound in his side. His nerves shrieked with pain as he did so, but Beornwulf steadied himself and cleared his mind of the agony. While there was breath left in his body, he vowed he would not be brought down by mere discomfort. He lifted his sword and found his right arm was still quite capable of hefting the short, sharp blade. It was only when he swung with too much vigour that the searing pain flared up within him. He tested it once again and found himself well capable of delivering a powerful strike. Beornwulf had quickly broken every sword he had ever owned. This one, however, was shorter and broader than any he had ever had in his possession. After consistently shattering every sword built for smaller, weaker men, he had taken it upon himself to design and forge a blade of his own, a blade that would not shatter from the force of a man as powerful as he. For Beornwulf was indeed a big man, over 6'7" and heavily built. He towered above his kinsfolk, and only once in his life had he and his warriors seen another man as big as he. It was on a legendary trip to Denmark many years past to aid King Hrothgar that Beo had battled with him. Grendel, the wild beast man, came to be known as, and when they clashed together in the Great Hall, wrestling hand to hand, it was recounted to have been like watching the old gods fighting. Beornwulf had grown a loyal following since that day. His people thought it likely that he was a descendant of the ancient giant kings that had roamed these parts in ages past, and perhaps they were correct. A man of his size and stature was rare in those days. His people had seen the possibility of greatness in the child Beornwulf long before he had become king, and with a man like him as their leader, none had dared to attack their hilltop stronghold in living memory, but those days, it seemed, were coming to an end. Wiglaf stood and reached for his greatcoat to protect himself from the brutal weather howling at the door. Beo stayed his arm and met his eyes. Wiglaf, this is not a task for you, my friend, nor is it the task of any man save me alone to go and meet my fate as I must this day. Live on, my friend, and tell tales of our adventures. Wiglaf's eyes narrowed as he spoke. You know I will not let you do this alone, dear Beo, for I would rather join you on one last adventure and test my mettle alongside you as I have in all our years of brotherhood, than live a day more on this earth having abandoned you at the last. They grinned at each other. Strength in friendship flowed between them, and excitement began to build for their final adventure. They grasped hands with a fierce grip, and clashed and ground their heads together in a Saxon warrior's pact. Beo sheathed his sword and patted the hilt of his dagger to make sure it was still in its scabbard. He hefted his shield, swung it onto his back, and with a mutual nod of readiness between them, Beo left his home for the last time without a backward glance. Ignoring his agony and the quizzical glances from his warriors, he strode boldly through the courtyard, eager to meet his fate, his head held high, but his heart hammering with a sensation he had not experienced often. He knew that this sensation was fear, and he was unaccustomed to it. It was undoubtedly a deep fear of the serpent, of the strange unknown monster that hid beneath the burial mound. There was also a fear of the wound that seemed to be quickly stealing the life away from him, but above both of these things there was a fear of dying with the sting of his defeat in his bones, and that was something he would not allow. Time was not on his side, but he was determined his story would be sung loudly and proudly by his people after he died. Beornwulf would go out fighting for his last breath, fighting for his people, fighting to leave this life victorious, exactly as he had lived it. They trudged on through the gates and began their march towards the serpent's lair at the foot of the Eagle's Head, the place where Beornwulf would meet his fate with a blade in his hand, fighting unto his last. 11 of his most loyal warriors followed after them without hesitation and without so much as a question. So went they, 13 men exiting the gates of the wooden fortress high above Gotha Farm, the farm of the Geats, beneath the enormous downland escarpment known as Ringmere, or the great hill ring surrounded by the sea. The wind began to whip mercilessly at them as they left the protection of the fortress walls. Rarely did a day go by on that high hill bluff that the wind did not blow heavy and hard, and for this reason, and because of their great love of sailing, the Anglo-Saxon hill fort people have come to be known as the wind-loving folk. The warriors narrowed their eyes as the drizzle lashed hard at their faces. They were barely able to see the path in front of them, but were so familiar with the land that they made their way with ease towards the steep sloping valley that led down to Morling and Ypwine's Float. That special place was one of Beornwulf's ancestors' first settlements. He had made good use of the well-built port and villa buildings left behind by the Romans there as they exited Britain some 400 years past. So long ago were those Romans here, and so prolific was their construction work, far surpassing the Saxon builders' abilities, that the local folk now whispered that giants had constructed the buildings and the port walls with their impossible arched stonework, but Beornwulf knew better. They had held many important wittans at the church on the promontory in years past, and he knew the history of the area well. In a short time they had reached the foot of the valley and made their way towards the stone wall and the magnificently constructed bridge that crossed over the Usa at the foot of the Eagle, connecting Morling to Ham and Offham. Beornwulf had always assumed that the Romans had built this enormous wall and bridge to defend their people, who it seemed had come here to settle along the edges of the tidal estuary and also by the rivers of the Midwind, which flowed back into the furthest reaches of the Usa inland. The remains of the Roman villas were still present there, with their strangely tiled floors and stone walls, but the Anglo-Saxons had not attempted to rebuild them as they fell into disrepair. They were a people who preferred to live in homes made of timber. They were proficient woodworkers and so had continued to build in this way. The hard, raised stone floors had proved useful as a footing for their own buildings, but as the population increased, the preformed Roman platforms for their homes had quickly been repurposed, and none were left to utilise now. Beornwulf strode boldly across the bridge to Ham and saw the beautiful church of St. Peter he had helped to construct standing proud atop the great mound, the abandoned seat of nobility. His heart began to thump loudly in his chest. No one had approached this promontory of the mainland in many years. So full of burial mounds and ancient tombs was it that the local people were sure it was a haunted place, and since the dragon had been discovered occupying this piece of land, the local populace had avoided it for many years. It was here, though, below the church, on the far side of the promontory, and at the foot of the steep scree and dirt slope, that the entrance to the Serpent's Lair was to be found. A stream flowed out from that place through an arched opening at the foot of the rise. The sulphurous water there was vaporous and hot. Beornwulf knew of many such springs across the downlands, but this one alone flowed out from beneath the mound, emerging as a deep stream which flowed into the sand of the sea estuary. The men stood together on the wall of the promontory above the flowing stream below, their eyes seeking fearfully for any sign of the serpent in the waters, but they saw nothing. Clearly the beast was hiding in his lair amongst his ancient treasures. Beornwulf turned to his men and saw the raw terror in their eyes. He too was afraid, but he would not let fear hold him back as it did so many others. He gathered his courage and addressed them for the last time. "Wait now on this hill, clad in your corselets, my warriors of great renown. This is not a tale's task for you, nor is it within the measure of any man save me alone to go and face this dread serpent as I must this day. I will slay it or die trying, and in victory or defeat I fear that this time I will not return. Live well, die brave, my friends." With those parting words, he lit his torch, strode boldly down the slope, and stepped purposefully into the hot, reeking stream. Adrenaline began to course through his blood as Beo waded his way to the centre of the wall from whence the hot waters flowed. It was up to his armpits now, and he knew that if it got any deeper he would not be able to continue. With a heavy sword and shield, swimming here would be impossible. Soon enough, though, he stood at the arched stone entrance to the lair and could no longer see his men above him. He licked his dry lips nervously. Never had he been so afraid. Now, screamed he, a challenge down the dark, dank tunnel to raise courage from within his heart, and deep under the earth he heard movement, a clinking of metal on metal. His pulse quickened further, but his resolve grew stronger. It was time to meet his fate. Beo ducked his head under the arch and slowly waded on under the promontory. The water was becoming slightly shallower here, and thankfully he was able to hold his sword above the waist-deep reek. His half-submerged shield pushed a small wake in front of him, his arm held fast through the handle loops, allowing him to grip the torch with his free hand. His eyes widened as he sensed a change in the motion of the steaming water ahead of him. Something was moving towards him. Beo screamed a war cry once more to gain courage, planted his feet in the slimy bed of the stream, and then, through the glow of the torch, he saw the thing coming at him through the water, winding and sliding, snake-like on the surface. It was roughly 10 feet in length, with tough, silver-scaled skin covering its entire body, and Beo saw a look of menace in its coal black eyes. Silently and with a dreadful purpose it came, and terror began to flood Beo's veins. Suddenly he was not so sure of himself, but it was too late. The fight was upon him. The beast's head reared up from the water and slammed into his shield. It held, but the creature was enraged and came at him again, its serpent tongue flicking at the air before the giant mouth opened and bit down hard on top of the shield's iron rim once more. Beo drew back his right arm and stabbed his sword forward around the side of his shield. The blade slid off the serpent's side with no effect, but he did not have room to swing the sword overhead in the small tunnel. He was now panicked and uncertain of how he could inflict a death blow.